our first presenter, Ms. Holly Mawn, who is a third grade teacher at the Alouds School, an all-girls independent school in Pittsburgh, PA. She has been an educator for 9 years with experience spanning from pre-K through 5th grade in both public and independent schools. She participated in the Summer Institute in 2020 with fellow Ellis school teachers Jen Lagan, who's teaching 3rd grade, and Jessica Nolan, who's teaching 4th grade. In her presentation, she is going to share their multi-year unit, Migration, which is designed to basically expand on that multi-year unit that 3rd and 4th grade students have always studied about immigration. And in 2020, they have decided to collaborate as 3rd and 4th grade teachers to find ways to revamp and globalize their units. In the end, they developed a multi-year look at immigration that 3rd and 4th grades that encourages students to foster authentic relationships and recognize contributions migrants have made in the United States. By making migration a recurring theme throughout 3rd and 4th grades, students are able to connect to the idea on a personal level as they think about their communities, their neighbors, and their own cultures. And without further ado, I would like to turn the microphone over to Ms. Holly Mawn and welcome her. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we are so keen to hear all about this wonderful project and unit. Thank you.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm looking on the screen and I'm seeing a 3rd grader or a former 3rd grader who just went through this unit and is going to get a preview on what she has coming up in 4th grade. So hi, Lola. Wonderful to see you. Hi, Jackie.
Hi.
That's a lovely surprise. I didn't know a fellow Ellis teacher was going to be here today. So thank you for the introduction. I wish that my colleagues, Jen and Jessica, could be here so you could get their perspectives as well. So I'm going to speak for the whole team as best as I can and do my best to represent everything that we did. I'm sure all of you have kind of gone through the same thing we have in the past couple years, where these past 2 years of teaching have just felt like such a blur. And trying to remember back to the summer of 2020 is like jumping back in a time machine. But we're going to go for it. It's wonderful to be back here and to see all of you doing this work. I hope it's been a productive week for you so far. So it's one of those funny things where we tell everyone what we're doing as we do it on Zoom. So here we go. Okay. So I just have a few slides here to kind of keep myself on track. I'll try to, most of it is visual. I'll try not to read off of the screen too much. Again, my name is Holly Mawn. I'm a 3rd grade teacher at the Ellis School in Pittsburgh. My co-teacher, Jen, is also a 3rd grade teacher. And then we worked with the 4th grade teacher, Jessica. And we came into this with the idea of wanting to collaborate on a multi-year unit on immigration. It begins in the spring of 3rd grade and finishes up in 4th grade. Our goal was to represent as many global cultures as possible through telling stories about the reasons for leaving a place and settling in a new location. We also wanted to recognize and highlight the contributions of the many cultures that have created what we know as America today. So when we came into this, we were really focused on specifically those 2 kind of units that end 3rd grade and begin 4th grade. And they were just kind of these, standalone immigration, really thinking about historical immigration, turn of the century, late 1800s into the early 1900s. We met with Dr. Goodhart, I believe was the presenter who really helped us shift our perspective from immigration to migration. So by taking the M off of immigration, we were able to look more broadly at migration patterns. So that allowed us to broaden our view and include migration of people within the US and the effect that those migration patterns have had. It really helped us globalize our view and to think about the fact that immigration doesn't stop. It's not static. It's not something where you come through Ellis Island and you're here and you're done. Your journey is not over. And so that was really helpful for us to kind of shift our perspectives and start to feel like, okay, we can see this theme throughout more than just those two standalone units that we have. So that was a really helpful perspective shift for us. Just a little bit of background too about kind of where our headspace was and what we're thinking about in the lower school at Ellis and throughout the whole school, but we'll focus on the lower school since we're lower school teachers. We are actively working to expand our curriculum to be more inclusive and diverse. That's something we're doing every year, every week, finding ways to bring in more perspectives. Our DEI director, DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know different places use different acronyms for that. Our director of DEI actually created an arc of learning for the lower school that looks at all different aspects of that. So we wanted to utilize that in our teaching. And we were taking a sense of where in our curriculum our students see themselves reflected. And in the DEI field, we call that mirrors. So, you're seeing yourself reflected back and where they're learning about others. So that's what we call windows. You're looking in at a culture that is different from yours or an experience that's different from yours. Our overall goal for students is to broaden their perspectives and include a more global view. We realized through doing our work in the Institute that migration lends itself well to being a lens for the whole year rather than those standalone units. So as we started to look at our whole curriculum, we noticed all of these places that migration and moving came up again and again and again, both in third grade and in fourth grade. Another interesting perspective shift that happened for us, I think when a lot of us hear like global studies, we think external, right? Anything except the United States. And one of our presenters kind of helped us remember that the US is part of the globe. So it didn't, it helped us to think about the fact, like, again, focusing on that migration within the US doesn't mean we're not being global. It gives us a better chance to think about the ways that perhaps other global communities have shaped our local communities. And also how those cultures kind of have shaped what American culture is today. Particularly that focus on culture, you'll see will come up a lot more in fourth grade once we get there. So I'll start, we're gonna go kind of in chronological order. We're gonna start with third grade, and then I'll take you into what they're doing in fourth grade. And if at any point I'm going too fast or you have a question, I don't know, Zita, are we going to have questions at the end? Can people unmute and jump in? Yes. Yeah. Okay. We'll have people, if you have a question, feel free to unmute and jump in, or we'll have time for questions at the end as well. So in third grade, the essential questions that we came up with were, why do people move? And that to dive a little deeper into that, what causes people to leave their homes to start new lives in different places? So we talk about the push and the pull factors, right? The push is what's moving you out of somewhere, and the pull is what's drawing you to a place. And of course, as we explore the why, we also are sure to include forced migration. So people who don't actually have any choice in why they're moving. That's something that has been a part of the third grade curriculum. And this kind of reminded us to really also make sure that that's not being silenced. What was life once like for immigrants in the United States? So that's where we're kind of sticking to our more traditional turn of the century Ellis Island immigration stories, largely European immigration stories. Where do we see migration in our curriculum? So as I said, this unit comes in the spring, it comes at the end of the school year. But what we realized as teachers is we're really front loading it throughout the whole year in a lot of the stories that we're reading, the things we're discussing, the social studies curriculum that we're looking at. So by the time we get here at the end of the year, we actually kind of let the girls lead our discussion of where else they've already seen these migration stories. And then, of course, are people still migrating, right? So with that historical focus, we realized that we were kind of leaving the girls to think that immigration is something that happened in the past, but of course we all know it's something that's still happening today, and migration is something that's happening today all the time. So we want them to come out of this with the understanding as well that this is not just a historical event, but something that continues today. So those are all kind of what we're focusing on in third grade. So as I said, one of the ways that we front load this is actually through our read alouds. So these are all read alouds that we have started since we did the Institute, except for the last one. So we brought in some new read aloud books. I highly recommend them if you have a third grader to read aloud to them, or if you teach third grade. They all have themes. They all have different cultural perspectives than our typical read alouds had in the past. So in The Elephant in the Room, the protagonist is the daughter of Turkish immigrants, and her mom has to go back to Turkey to deal with some immigration visa problems. And it's like a lovely, wonderful story. And India No More, it's set in 1950s in California, or in the West Coast. And it's about a young girl and her family whose tribe is delisted. And so it's kind of an interesting, they end up moving from the Pacific Northwest down to LA. It's a really interesting look at just culture and movement. And again, kind of a different look at almost a forced migration of what happens when part of your identity is not officially recognized anymore. Prairie Lotus, we read aloud while we are reading in our reading class, Little House in the Big Woods. So the author, Linda Sue Park, loved the Little House books growing up, but didn't see herself represented in them, and in fact felt some moments of being othered by reading them. So she kind of reimagined what the story would look like if the protagonist were not white. And it's a really interesting, almost reverse migration pattern where the protagonist, Hannah, and her father actually start in LA and move east, rather than a lot of the kind of frontier stories that we hear about people moving west. So it's an interesting look at kind of flipping the script on that story. And then Front Desk takes place in the 90s and is about a Chinese immigrant family that ends up also in the LA area and running a motel, and they have kind of a stream of fellow immigrants that come through and stay secretly in the motel that they're running. So they're all really interesting stories, just good to read on their own. And then they're really helpful when we get to this question of why do people move. These are some of the stories that the girls can kind of pull from. They already have that background knowledge of all of these different people who've had to move, and just how varied their stories can be. When we do get to our official immigration or migration unit, one of the things that we do is we start with that question, why do people move, and where have we seen it in our curriculum? So we expect our students to be able to look back at, for example, these read aloud books. And then we also, and we talk about what are the pushes, what are the pulls, where did they start, where did they end up, and what challenges did they face either on their journey or when they arrived. We have a little almost graphic organizer for them to kind of think through those factors. And then we also read other more kind of traditional, again, turn of the century immigration stories and have them answer those same questions. So these are just on the left here, these are just some of the books that we have the girls read either as a whole class independently or in partners. And they represent all different stories of leaving and moving and journeys. And we also have some more modern stories that we've thrown in there, including some refugee stories, which is an interesting addition that, especially with what's going on in the world today, we find it really important for the girls to understand that, you know, some migrants are refugees, and what does that mean? And what is that word, and how are their journeys and their pushes and pulls different than, say, someone who is choosing to move for a different reason. One of the problems that we had faced in the past, and this will come up again in fourth grade, with this kind of traditional immigration lens, was that we realized that it was leaving out a whole group of people. And so, because a lot of those stories are European, they are often representing, you know, just European stories. Obviously, that is not the makeup of our country, and it's not the makeup of historically, you know, who's here and why. So as I mentioned, we do talk about forced migration. And as we're doing our historical immigration unit, we also pull in the Underground Railroad and look at, we don't discuss like slavery exactly, but we do to kind of talk about slavery in the sense of forced migration. And then we talk about how the Underground Railroad was a really important tool in the migration of formerly enslaved people. So two of the books that we read there are The Daring Escape of Ellen Craft, which, if you haven't heard the story, is actually quite interesting. She was she and her husband were both enslaved, but she passed for white and dressed up as a white man, and pretended that her husband was, that she owned her husband, and they escaped from the South to freedom in Philadelphia by dressing her up and passing as white. So that's a really interesting story that the girls really kind of turns everything on their head, and we spend some time talking about that. Henry's Freedom Box is about a man who mailed himself to freedom in Philadelphia, from the South up to Philadelphia. So again, just looking at all of the different ways that people move, their reasons for moving, and how those journeys can be so varied and so different. We end the year with a story, and this is where we get back to that. Does immigration still happen, or does migration still happen? The girls get to interview either a family member or someone from the Ellis community who has immigrated or migrated in the past 150 years. So if, for example, you had a family member who passed through Ellis Island, and you have another family member who knows a lot about them, and you have artifacts about them, you can research them and their journey and their story, and share about that. What the shift to migration did for us is opened it up to allow more students to talk to more recent family members. So we've had people who have moved for job opportunities and things like that, or people who have moved multiple times throughout their lives because of job opportunities, because of schooling. It's really widened who they're able to talk to. So this is one of our students who interviewed an Ellis community member about his mother's immigration story. So the girls do the interview, they write a report, and then they share it out with their class at the end of the year. So that's kind of ties it all together for us. Just one last thing about third grade. And this is more of a goal than something that's actually happened yet, but we have talked with our lower school art teacher about doing some cross-curricular work and studying some artists who look at migration patterns through their artwork. So, you know, as things go when you're existing in the pandemic, we haven't quite gotten there yet, but this is our goal moving forward, is that the girls will also be looking at migration in the art studio. So that's all about third grade. Now I'm going to speak for the fourth grade teacher, Jessica, and hope that I do her justice because they are doing a lot of really great work there. So in fourth grade, this kind of starts in the fall with the question, why do people migrate and why do they settle where they do? So similar questions to what we were looking at. Why do migrants face obstacles and what kinds of obstacles do they face? Why do people migrate within a country? So again, once you're here, your journey is not necessarily done. So what pushes and pulls are happening within your own country? And then what cultural contributions can be attributed to migration? So that's where that culture piece really starts to come up more in fourth grade. Just some of the titles that they look at in fourth grade. So in fourth grade, they start with a review of Ellis Island, but then also shift over to Angel Island, which is where Asian immigrants were coming through it off the coast of San Francisco in California. So looking at those immigrants and what specific challenges they faced. I'll get into it a little bit later. We also look in fourth grade, they also end up looking at the Great Migration and how that kind of has shaped different cities and cultures within the East Coast and West Coast of the United States. Also, this goes both in social studies and reading. There's a lot of cross-curricular work going on. So one of the books they read in fourth grade is Esperanza Rising, which is about migrant workers in Mexico and California. So really cool, like cross-cultural studies going on in fourth grade, focusing on the migration of food and how food is such an important part of culture and how that's something that sticks with us throughout migration and throughout moves. So in reading class, they read the book Love, Sugar, Magic, which is about Mexican-American immigrants in Texas who have a bakery and some of the traditional ingredients and recipes that end up in their bakery. They also are reading, so half of the girls are reading that book. The other half will be reading this book, Midsummer's Mayhem, which is about an Indian American family. And again, food and recipes are coming up again and again throughout that story. Food is obviously something that, well, I won't say we all love, but most people really love food. So, and it really has those cultural connections and roots. So this past year and moving forward, Jessica was able to use the literature as kind of a jumping off point to talk about food and culture and families' culture. And she also then collaborated with our Spanish teacher and looked specifically at Mexican ingredients and how those have blended into American culture. And they actually took a deep dive into the history of chocolate. So that's something that was really cool for them to look at, where chocolate comes from and how that's a global ingredient. The science teacher also jumped on board with this project. And as the girls started to study recipes and ingredients and flavors, our science teacher helped them pick one ingredient to study and see, what kind of climate is that coming from? Like, how is the climate of where that ingredient comes from shaping the culture and shaping the food there too? So it's all kind of weaving together into this flavor profile and how flavors and ingredients actually migrate with people as well. The library teacher also jumped in on this and added it in as a whole big research project. So this really turned into quite the theme and project for the girls. They ended up choosing one family recipe to study, and then took one specific ingredient from that to study and then present on to the class. So we had girls studying, for example, this is just one example, looking at some Israeli food and what ingredients are going into that. looking at like one specific ingredient from a Jamaican recipe and where does that come from and how does that affect the flavor profile of food. So this is a chance for the girls to really look inward at a family recipe and see how their family recipes are influenced by their family's migration stories. Our director of DEI also came in for this and was able to help the girls kind of focus on different regions and what different regions food groups looked like and why, and what historical patterns and migration patterns had led to those kind of flavor profiles in those different regions. So that's a really cool way and that project did not exist before we had done this institute. So that's a really cool way that that our perspective was broadened and our curriculum shifted. In fourth grade, again, these historical immigration stories are still coming up. So as they study the people who came through Ellis Island and Angel Island and what kind of where they landed, either on the West Coast or the East Coast, the girls read and study fictionalized immigration stories and then end up creating their own kind of journal or diary for those characters that they studied. And so that's looking at, the problems that they faced along the way, the different cultural connections that they make once they get to a new place. This idea that community and culture can become part of your community. So as you land somewhere, you might not have known these people before because they have a shared culture. Now they're your community. And so the girls use all of the things they've learned about immigration, plus everything they know about, story elements, characters, problems, solutions, settings, to write these journals. One of the things historically that Jessica was feeling was lacking from this was, again, what we said in third grade, a lot of these were European stories or because of Angel Island, Asian stories. But again, she felt like there were just some cultural pieces that were missing, specifically the African-American or Black experience. So the students do this project and it's either really a European story or an Asian American story. But after they get through this, the theme of migration continues throughout the year, and they're not leaving it behind as they move on to studying the Great Migration. So as they study the Great Migration, they're looking at that in both social studies and reading class and in their read alouds. So in reading class, they're reading Bud Not Buddy and looking at that migration story, which actually is not officially part of the Great Migration, but is happening around a timeline. And then the read alouds that they're doing are Finding Langston and Leaving Lyman, which are both Great Migration stories, and kind of starting to look at the Harlem Renaissance, looking at the Jazz Age, and just some more artistic cultural influences that happened because of the Great Migration. Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Yes, so these also have connections outside of the classroom to art class and to music class, where they're studying artists from the Harlem Renaissance in art class, and they are also studying jazz music in music class. And again, because they've had all of this kind of background knowledge about immigration and migration, the conversation comes up again and again of why are people moving? What influences are they having when they get there? And what are their journeys looking like? So that is what we have. So I know I threw a lot of information at you. It is, like I said, essentially the theme of 2 years worth of work. So we certainly feel like we have some more work to do in continuing to deepen our projects and make sure that we are really doing justice to these topics. But we feel like we've done a lot more in the past 2 years than we had previously. And we've been able to really open up the topic and bring in more perspectives and let the students see more perspectives than we had in the past. So we feel like we're on a good track to adding some breadth and some depth to our migration units.
Thank you so much, Holly, for a really intriguing and fascinating presentation. Wonderful job on this project. Yeah, it looks amazing. And I'm sure our teachers do have questions, so I'll let them speak up. And I think we can stop the recording just to, allow for